President Johnson and Congress, okay? Something to keep in mind is that 5 days after the assassination of President Kennedy, the new president addressed Congress, which would not be unusual that he would do that. So just 5 days after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, the new president, Lyndon Johnson, addressed Congress to tell them what his plan was for the remainder of the Kennedy administration. And he asked the members of Congress during that address to complete the programs that President Kennedy had initiated. So it was Lyndon Johnson's goal, as he spoke to members of Congress 5 days after the assassination, that he wanted his administration to complete all programs that were initiated by President Kennedy. And he asked Congress to support him in that endeavor. Now, we've talked about one specific piece of legislation that Kennedy initiated but did not get passed until after his assassination. Anybody remember what that was? Civil Rights Act. And it eventually became known as the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And that was passed on July 2nd, 1964. Now, it was revised a little bit from when Kennedy sent it to Congress, and we'll talk about that. But as a first step in the direction of completing programs initiated by President Kennedy, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 on July 2nd, 1964. Now, got anybody kind of remember in the back of their mind, Jalen, do you remember what that law was scheduled to state, basically? Oh, I think you might go to take a guess. Anybody? What were they talking about that time? We gave some examples of Jim Crow laws. What was the idea behind the Civil Rights Act that Kennedy sent to Congress? What was it going to eliminate? Discrimination and segregation. Okay? Well, the new law read this. The new Civil Rights Act of 1964 required the following two things. One, it stated that racial discrimination was illegal in the use of federal funds. Said that racial discrimination was illegal in the use of federal funds. We'll talk about that in a minute. That racial discrimination was illegal in the use of federal funds. So basically, what are they saying there? Yeah, neither could really the school. Do we use federal funds to run the school? We do. So you could not discriminate based on race on anything that had to do with the use of federal funds. Okay? That was the first thing it stated. The second thing that the Civil Rights Act of 64 stated, it desegregated all businesses based on what? Huh? 5 things. What? Race, gender, they call it sex at that time, so if you want the proper terminology, it was desegregation of all businesses based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. Okay, so the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the second thing it required was the desegregation of all businesses based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. What's national origin? Where you're born. Okay? All right. Yes? Private club, like a golf course? Yeah. We still have golf courses today that segregate blacks. And you know the biggest golf tournament ever that had to overcome that? The Masters golf tournament in Augusta. Augusta National was a segregated golf course for a lot of years. And in recent history was changed, way after this. Okay, so we still had a few of those. But they're basically stating that you cannot discriminate in the use of federal funds, and a business such as a hotel or restaurant, theater, etc. could not discriminate and not let people in based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. That was the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now here are some other acts or laws that were passed during the time that Johnson served out the remainder of Kennedy's term. Okay? Johnson was a law passer. But these laws were initiated by who? President Kennedy, okay? First one was called VISTA, and it stood for Volunteers in Service to America. VISTA, Volunteers in Service to America. VISTA, again, Volunteers in Service to America. Anybody want to guess what that might have done? What did VISTA do? Volunteers in Service to America. What do you think it did? I'll give you a hint. It was the opposite, so to speak, of the Peace Corps. So what was the Peace Corps? It helped people where? Foreign countries. VISTA was basically a domestic Peace Corps that provided help for poor people in the United States. So Volunteers in Service to America, better known as VISTA, was basically a domestic Peace Corps. Not a foreign Peace Corps that helped people in foreign countries, but a domestic Peace Corps that helped the poor in the United States. Okay, another act that was passed by Congress during the time Johnson served out the remainder of the Kennedy term was the Wilderness Act of 1964. The Wilderness Act of 1964. Okay, what do you think that is? It's kind of self-explanatory. Anybody here into the Forest Service, the Wilderness? What did the Wilderness Act of 1964 do? What would a Wilderness Act do? Okay, what it would do to protect the forest would put aside so many acres to be considered what? Wilderness, where you couldn't build on them or, you know, four-wheelers on them or anything like that. Well, the Wilderness Act of 1964 set aside 9 million acres of national forest and national park land and designated those 9 million acres as wilderness, where you couldn't take ATVs in, you couldn't maybe sometimes go in there and you couldn't take your RV because there wouldn't be any roads, you couldn't go in there and cut down the trees. What's that? Can't ride your, yeah, anything. So the Wilderness Act of 1964 basically was set up so that we would guarantee we would have 9 million acres of wilderness in our national forests and national parks. Now the next two, or so I'm going to talk about, are really important to you as you sat here today. The first one was the National Defense Education Act. The National Defense Education Act. And we're going to break that down into two other laws. The National Defense Education Act. And it's going to actually have a definition, but we're going to break it down. What the National Defense Education Act is, it gave federal dollars to schools, colleges, and universities. It gave federal dollars to schools, colleges, and universities. It revolutionized education and came up the term free public education. Okay? So the National Defense and Education Act gave federal dollars to schools, colleges, and universities. Now, there were two specific laws that were covered under NDEA. The first was the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act, and the other one was called the Higher Education Act. So within the parameters of the National Defense and Education Act were two other laws, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act and the Higher Education Act. Now, what do you think the Elementary and Secondary Education Act provided? Government money for what? Elementary and high schools to pay for textbooks, supplies, lunches, and I'm going to kind of give you an idea how this works in today's terms. Wyoming is very well financed educationally. I'll tell you the difference between Montana and Wyoming, and I'm probably a little off on the numbers, but I don't think I'm far off. What you get your federal funding for is called ADA, average. Am I losing my mind here? Average number attending, ANA, sorry, average number attending. And what happens is we get our money based on the number of students that we have in the school. federal dollars. Now, if you're in Mr. Nicholas's position as superintendent, this is an important time for you right now, because the legislature is going to make a decision here, probably in March, on what that dollar figure is going to be per child. Okay? Now in Montana, you average about $4,000 or $5,000 they give you per kid that's in your school. In Wyoming, it's like $13,000 to $16,000. Way more money. Okay? Because they use what kind of money to help with education in this state? Oil money. Okay? So, natural resources. So what they're looking for is they base how much money you're going to get for next year based on what? This year's attendance. Okay? So if you have 12 kids in the high school drop out, if you have 12 less kids in the high school this year than you had last year, then that 12 times 16,000 is going to be a shortfall that you're going to not have in your budget. Then you have to start making decisions. Are you going to give teachers raises? Are you going to cut staff? Or are you going to quit paying for meals on away trips? Bigger problem in Montana, because you only get like 5,000 a kid. I mean, I'll give you an example. The federal dollars that when I was superintendent at Roberts School, was about twice as big as Tensley. The biggest budget I ever had was $800,000 a year to run on. Tensley, who has half as many kids, probably about, I don't know, they have 80 total, K-12 probably. I think their budget's like $2.8 million for those kids. So you divide the number of kids by that budget, and you're going to spend quite a bit per kid. But what's the biggest percentage of a budget? Of our budget here that Mr. Nicholas gets to run the school, what's most of the money go toward? Paying people. Very good. So about 80% of a budget normally is paying for the help. That would be the teachers, the aides, the administration, the cooks, everybody. About 80% of a budget is paying for the personnel, which leaves about 20% of the budget for what? You. Now Wyoming is very fortunate because it would be unheard of that they would pay for your meals in Montana on a away trip. The only time when I was in Montana we ever paid for the kids' meals is if we stayed overnight. That was the only time. Okay? And we didn't stay overnight ever because our farthest away trip was like 60 miles. So it's a lot different. You're very fortunate. But the point being, if it wasn't for the National Defense Education Act, and especially the Elementary and Secondary Education Act that was passed during the time that Johnson cleared out Kennedy's term, you wouldn't be getting this. Now, do you think Johnson would have an easier time passing this type of legislation than Kennedy? Why would he? He did. Well, do private schools get this money? Does Carroll College get federal funding? No, because it's a private Catholic school. Does Rocky Mountain College get federal funding, which we'll talk about in the Higher Education Act? No. You have to be a state institution to get money, okay? Well, what was Kennedy's religion? Catholic, and I think people thought this would never happen because he was going to give all the money to the damn Catholics. I mean, that's what people thought. Okay, when Mitt Romney ran for president in the last election, it came up that, boy, is he going to start funding private Mormon schools? I'm telling you, it was an incredible discussion. But the point being is that Johnson had a better chance to pass it because of his religious issue wasn't an issue at all. And it was a great act. So that's the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. The Higher Education Act, self-explanatory. It gave government money for financial aid to what? Colleges. You guys that are, Nicholson just got a hell of a good scholarship, and so did Alex from the University of Wyoming, trustee scholarship. Where do you think that money came from? Part of it probably from trustees, but this financial aid, all these things, your FAFSA forms that you're going to be filling out to go to college, you wouldn't get that if it wasn't for the Higher Education Act that was passed during Johnson's term in which he served out the rest of Kennedy's. These are very, very important laws that affect you today. So those are some different acts that Congress passed during the time Johnson filled out the rest of Kennedy's term. So now we're going to go to the election of 1964 and talk about Johnson getting elected to his own term and his own administration coming into American history. So the election of 1964. But there were some important laws passed by Lyndon Johnson to benefit you as you sit here today. And there'll be more. Especially for me. And I'll tell you about that when we get to it. Okay. When the election of 1964 came about, there was no question who was going to be the Democratic nominee. Who was going to be the Democratic nominee? Lyndon Johnson. Okay, not a problem at all. The only drama at the Democratic National Convention was who he was going to choose as his vice presidential running mate. And I'd like somebody to guess who that might be. You've heard of it before. Anybody have a guess who that might be? That we talked about, that ran for the presidency in 1960 but didn't get the nomination? What do you, raise your hand. Yes. No? Raise your hand. No, this is the Democrat. Raise your hand. Don't blurt it out. No, Republican. Democrats, think of the guys that were in the running in 1960 for the Democratic nomination. Anybody? Yes?
It wasn't Rockefeller, was it?
No, he's Republican. Remember, there were several of them that were running for the nomination. It's finally, there were 4 senators, right? Come on, you can look back.
Was it the guy Kennedy beat out?
Yeah? Give me a name. It's important today. You can look in your notes, give me a name. Somebody give me a name of who he nominated. Johnson, had to be a Democrat. Was a candidate in 1960 but didn't get the nomination, ran out of money.
Humphrey.
Who said that? You said Hubert Humphrey?
And she actually did.
She did? Well, here's what you get for that. A cut signature of Hubert Humphrey, which is worth some money. She
Well, I said it like Robert.
Oh, did she say it first?
I heard.
Okay, there you go, you keep that. Cut signature, Hubert Humphrey. Hubert Humphrey will be the vice presidential candidate with Johnson. Now, the Republican Party's in a little bit of disarray, and they're going to have some difficulty choosing their candidate because they've got kind of a split in the party. Okay? What do they have in the party that's a split? What type of Republicans are split up? Anybody know?
Is it the Southern
But be more,
issue of race?
no, well, not so much that, but philosophy.
Conservative and liberal.
Very good. You had conservative Republicans and liberal Republicans. And they were kind of jostling. They were having trouble getting along. So you had the conservative wing of the Republican Party in 1964, and you had the liberal wing.
I have a question.
Yeah.
If JFK would have lived, would he have been the Democratic
No.
nomination? Like,
No question.
Like Lyndon was?
Only thing, we'll kind of get in that later. Bobby Kennedy was very nervous. Some stuff that wasn't so positive was going to come out on his brother. Some of his extramarital affairs and some of his health and stuff. And boy, that was a big concern of JFK going into 64. And he was really worried about Rockefeller in 64 too, to be honest with you. But anyway, that's a good question. Now, the conservative Republicans supported Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona. That's who the conservative Republicans want. And the liberals weren't real hot on him, but the problem was the liberals didn't have a very good candidate that they thought maybe could handle the presidency. But they're going to want to have what in this election, the liberals? What are they going to want in this election? Huh? What would they want? Some say, wouldn't they? So what's the best way for Goldwater to give the liberals some say?
A liberal vice.
Nominate a liberal vice president. And that's what Goldwater basically gave the impression to the party, that he would balance the ticket with a liberal vice presidential candidate. That was what he kind of gave the thought process to. So Senator Goldwater gave the liberal wing of the party the idea that he would balance the ticket and he would choose a liberal candidate as his running mate for president or for vice president. So if he does that, the liberals are going to support him and he's probably going to win on the first ballot. Okay? Well, they did support him. They took him at his word, and he was nominated on the first ballot for the presidency. The trouble was, after he got his nomination, he chose conservative Congressman William Miller as his running mate. So once he got the nomination, he went ahead and picked a conservative as his running mate in Congressman William Miller. How do you think that went over? Not very good. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit about politics in the 60s. I think I've told you this before, but I have to repeat myself because I'm good at it. In those times, probably 70% of people in America considered themselves Republican. and about 30% considered themselves Democrats. So for a Democratic nominee to win the presidency, he had to win his 30% and half of the 70% that were Republicans. Well, what happened here is once the liberal wing of the party found out that a conservative in Congressman William Miller was chosen by Goldwater, many liberals did what in the election? Voted for Johnson, the Democrat. They were so upset. It was political suicide for Goldwater. Nobody really could figure out what he was thinking. Now, when you talk about popular vote in an election, what's a pretty good victory? I mean, 50-50 is tie. What's a good victory in popular vote in that election? Well, that'd be a butt kick. You know, 55-45, even 53-47 is a pretty good margin in popular vote. Well, Johnson defeated Goldwater, winning 61% of the popular vote. That was incredible at the time, especially when you looked at the number of people that considered themselves Republicans. He wins 61% of the popular vote. There were 538 total electoral votes to earn. 538. Johnson captured 486. I mean, this was really a big romp. So 538 total electoral votes in this election. Johnson wins 486 and 61% of the popular vote. Goldwater only got 52 electoral votes in this election. That is a big time spanking in a political election. And it's because Goldwater was not using good political sense. If he would have nominated a liberal vice president, this could have been a whole different story. Johnson, I think political analysts say probably would have still won, but it would have been a lot closer, and maybe not. Who knows?
Didn't Goldwater only win like 4 states?
Yeah, there was very few. Yeah, I believe he won his own state of Arizona. And then, I'm not sure on that either, to be honest with you.